Bom dia a todos e a todas. É um prazer receber todo mundo, todos vocês aqui para mais um evento do nosso International Dialogues in Constitutional Law. E a partir de agora, I'll start to speak in English. Thank you very much, all of you, the audience, and especially thank you very much, Professor Jeanette Hofmann, for being here with us today and this morning. And it's a pleasure to have you here to hear you about such a important subject all over the world and in Brazil in particular. And Professor Hofmann is professor of political science at the Free University of Berlin. She's also the research director of the Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society, and also a researcher at the WZB, Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin. I don't know if there is a translation in English. It's Social Science Center Berlin. And Berlin, okay, Berlin Social Science Center, WZB, and I would also like to thank the German Embassy and the German General Consulate in São Paulo, in Brasilia and São Paulo, for the support and to actually the organization and support for this lecture. Thank you, Michael Westland, and I think that before we start, I don't want to forget that we will also have 2 lectures next week. Andrea Pozos from Mexico and Matthias Krumm also from Berlin. And but now, Professor Hofmann, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. And after the lecture, we'll have, as usual, enough time to discussion, questions in English, in any language you want. We translate, no problems at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Perhaps first a few words about me. As you already said, my background is in political science, but for a long time I haven't been really a political scientist because I used to work in a research group that had a strong focus on technology of society, sociology of technology and technology and society. So that is my background for a long time. And then I discovered the internet as a research area in the early 1990s and started working on what we call today internet governance, which basically deals with the question of what is regulating the internet, what norms, what people, what actors, what forces, but also how should it be regulated. And that question played a major role because, as you know, the internet is more of a transnational infrastructure and differs in this respect quite considerably from ordinary telecommunication infrastructures. And I've also been practically involved in this area for a long time. And for that reason, I've been to Brazil several times because the Brazilian government also had a quite significant role in this debate on internet governance. So that's why I also have been here already. And then a couple of years ago, I noticed that the question of digitalization and democracy became more and more prominent in the public debate. And I began to wonder actually how we should look at this relationship. How should we conceptualize the relationship between digitalization and democracy? And that question I became so obsessed with that just by accident I became more of a political scientist again, dealing with questions of democratic change. So when we look at the public debate that we see on democracy and digitalization, that question of how should we discuss it actually never plays a role. There seems to be a clear understanding of how to look at it, and the way we look at it in public discourse shows a clear division of work between what digitalization does and what democracy does. Digitalization typically seen as the driver of change. It is the active part that pushes democracy in this or that reaction, and democracy looks strangely passive, like a static system that either becomes strengthened, refreshed, woken up, or right now many people think it gets damaged, it's under threat, it gets undermined by digitalization. But democracy as such seems not to do anything in this relationship. So what we usually implicitly say about this relationship is that it's a matter of causality. Digitalization evolves, 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 mostly thought of in a linear, straightforward way, and democracy is sort of impacted by it. It's at the moment the sort of weak victim of digitalization. Since I have this background in sociology of technology, I always wondered whether things are so simple or whether we need a different look at it, a different way to look at it. So I started to think more conceptually about this relationship and came up with a term that I'm now working on, and that will, what my talk will actually focus on. That's what I called mediated democracy, assuming that democracy is always in one way or another already mediated. And for that reason, the relationship between democracy and digitalization is less one of a causal relationship where one sort of just impacts the other one, but that it's a mutual thing. It's a constellation where digitalization has an impact on democracy, but democracy at the same time impacts the cause of digitalization. In order to explain what I mean with that, with this concept of mediated democracy, I will go back a bit into history and look at an early example. More specifically, I will look at an author who described what I mean by a constellation of democracy and digitalization. And the example I have in mind is the book Imagine Communities by Benedict Anderson. Some people might know it. I personally love that book. I think it tells a wonderful story about how imagined communities came about. What does he mean by that, imagined communities? Benedict Anderson, who was of Irish origin and then moved to the US and became a political theorist, he was interested in the question of how actually does nationalism evolve? Nationalism not in a negative way as we look at it at the moment, but more in a neutral way, understood as a feeling of belonging among people who never get to know each other in person. And that he found an interesting phenomenon. How can you Brazilians feel as Brazilians even though you don't know most of the other fellow Brazilians? How do we get that kind of connection among people? And as you can see on that picture, one of the explanations he gave, and that for him played quite a major role, is the media. The media, he said, creates a network among people and a feeling of simultaneity, because everybody used to read the newspaper or watch the news in the evening at the same time. And most people were reading the same news, had the same understanding of what is relevant, what happens in the world or what happens in the local village where one lives. And one is aware that the others do read the same stuff too and have the same kind of understanding. And he said that is a major point for the development, the evolution of a feeling of belonging among strangers. So he came up with a number of explanations how this imagined communities actually can evolve. And the key word he shaped for that explanation is what he called print capitalism. Print capitalism, in my understanding, the way I read this book, is a constellation of quite a number of heterogeneous developments. Part of them are completely independent of each other. There is, on the one hand, the development of the printing press as a technology. Then there is what he's coined as print capital, meaning the resources that entrepreneurs who started producing newspapers needed in order to set up their business. It needed quite a lot of resources to do so, not trivial at that time. And then there is this long-term process of secularization, meaning that the dominance of the church for organizing and interpreting the world lost in influence and got sort of replaced by other types of texts and types of understanding of the world. And finally, what I also quite like is the role he ascribes to languages. In most countries, I mean actually even before countries as nation states existed, the language communities were very small. Already 2 villages further along, a few kilometers along, people might speak a dialect that would be absolutely different from the one where you came from, and you would have problems understanding. And finally, not on the slide, there is also the idea of literacy. People need to be able to read and write in the same language for a market for newspapers to evolve, to have a chance. A newspaper is a commercial product, and you need a number of readers to actually make a good business out of it. So you have this constellation of very different, very different things that need to come together to create what he calls print capitalism. Print capitalism, in turn, then becomes the precondition for a public sphere over geographic distances to emerge. There is, as he would describe it, not a necessity for public spheres to emerge, but it becomes the possibility. Without printing press, without newspapers, there is no chance for a public sphere to actually evolve over great distances. And the public sphere, in turn, is the condition for the demos, for a political subject to emerge. And the political subject is the precondition for a political regime that we call representative democracy to emerge. All of them are not necessarily related, but they become sort of a possibility. So what can we learn from that story that Benedict Anderson tells for the question of democracy and digitalization? First of all, technology is a crucial thing, but as such, it doesn't explain anything. We could have used the printing press for just printing Bibles. There was not a sort of a linear development from the printing press to the newspaper. And then we can see that what the newspaper becomes is very much impacted by what we call in the West Enlightenment, that there is this idea people should determine their own fate, and that depends on a certain kind of knowledge. That is what all sorts of genres of text carry forward in the course of secularization. So what we see here, what printing press actually does, the way it becomes influential, depends on social change, and it also depends on political change. And what I find perhaps the most important message is how closely media and democracy are actually interrelated. The printing press is the condition for representative democracy. And there are political theorists who would say each type of media infrastructure creates its own form of democracy, makes possible a specific type of democracy. In the oral society, you have sort of a direct democracy, the one sort of the ideal type Athens model. That could only evolve in an area where people had to meet. They had to have a different way of self-determining their life than what we could do under conditions of the printing press. So democracy and media are much more closely intertwined than we are typically willing to see. That is sort of my big assumption underlying the idea of mediated democracy. So I want to now go a step further and look at something that we call the change of democracy, or the crisis of representative democracy, that in my understanding started much, much earlier than social media that we today like to blame for the pathologies that we see before social media occurred. So we look at this constellation, but look at it from a democratic perspective. In political theory, there have been published quite a lot of works that deal with the change of representative democracy that we have seen in the last 20, 30 years. There is, for example, the very popular notion of post-democracy, a term coined by Colin Crouch in 2004. What he sort of summarized under the term of post-democracy is a decline of effective political participation. He said that democracy is something that is rather demonstrated than actively lived nowadays. And his prime example are elections that he says are completely without consequences today. It doesn't matter anymore. He said that with a view on Europe, but I think he wrote it in a more general way. He said it doesn't matter anymore today what kind of political party we vote for, because the outcome will always be the same. And his major explanation for that development is that we have privatized formally public tasks to an extent that the private sector has become really powerful and sets the terms in very narrow ways for what parliaments actually can decide. So for him, democracy is something more demonstrated than actually lived, because it has been undermined by the power of, as he says, the capital. A bit of a similar argument has been made by a German political theorist called Ingolfur Blühdorn. He published a book in 2013 called The Simulated Democracy. And what he described here was what he calls a paradox between the broad societal agreement on democratic norms on the one hand, but a very low level of practical, empirical participation in democratic environments on the other. He says there's a constant claim, a request for more political rights, but a very underwhelming degree of making use of these democratic rights. His diagnosis is that after a rather politically active period in the 60s, 70s and early 80s, people became actually tired of participating in democracy, because their own individual life, self-optimizing one's career, one's families, one's children, focusing on one's own well-being became so much more important, so that most people today want democratic rights but hope that our friends, colleagues and fellow national citizens take care of them on our behalf. So that's his diagnosis. And then there is the Australian political scientist John Keane. He published a book in 2013 that he called The Monitory Democracy. He declares in this book the end of representative democracy on the grounds of elections becoming less and less important. And his explanation for that is a growing level of distrust in democratic institutions in general, and in our parliaments and representatives in particular. He says we don't trust them anymore, so even if we go voting and delegate our own democratic right and self-determination to political representatives, we do not trust them anymore, and we do authorize them in a different way than we used to. He says what we are doing today, and we do that thanks to social media, is observe and control them. And we comment on everything they do. We follow them along, we compare what they do to what they promise to do, and we find them all wanting. So the public sphere has become much more important in his understanding, particularly social media, and it demonstrates a shift also in the relationship between represented and the representatives. And then the final example I want to mention is a book by Pierre-Rosan Vallon, a French theorist, a book he published in 2008 that he called Counter-Democracy. It's a bit of a confusing title, and not many people actually like it, but he is someone who said that our democratic constitutions do not longer describe the democracy that we actually have, because so much goes on that is not described in our constitution and was also not foreseen in the constitution. The democratic constitutions typically focus on people's right to vote. That is sort of the center of political self-determination according to our constitutions. But what we do practically is that less and less people go to vote, make use of that right, and they do other things instead. A bit of what John Keane also describes, but what he rather calls as negative sovereignty, or also as veto democracy. He says negative sovereignty, what he means by that is that we become as people very good no-sayers. We say no, no, no to lots of things, and we also even use our right to vote as a way of punishing former governments. We vote by punishing former governments, and we say no to everything they do. But what we are actually lacking at the moment is a positive vision of democracy. In most democracy today, we have no shared understanding anymore what we want, how we want democracy to work, and what we actually want to use it for. And that's what he calls a negative way of counter-democracy. Counter-democracy, meaning that we all become politically active beyond voting, he thinks is a positive thing. But if we only use it to punish and to say no and to judge, but when we don't use it for a positive vision of what we want, then he finds it pathological. So that is his description of what goes wrong with representative democracy. What they all say is that political parties do not represent the will of the people any longer, and that we see new forms of collectives emerging. So I will sum up these observations that I just mentioned. We see a decline in significance of elections. We see a decline in the role of political parties. We also see a decline in the significance of parliaments. And I perhaps should say again why that is. We see a shift of power from parliaments to the executive branch. In many political areas, we see that decisions are actually made by ministries and not any longer by the members of the parliament. We see a shift of power from public authorities to the private sector, which manages lots of issues today by means of self-regulation. We see an increasing power of international fora and organizations having to do with globalization, because many issues such as climate change cannot be handled on the national level anymore. And then finally, we also see an increasing role of the public sphere. the public sphere really becomes a power in its own right. So this is the diagnosis that we see, and formally, if we look at it, as nothing to do much with social media. John Keane describes sort of a lot of responsibility to social media for this development, but many of these phenomena make sense as observations without thinking about the internet. And I find this really important to keep this in mind, that democracy is changing independently of having an internet, meaning a new communication infrastructure or not. So that's why it's interesting to look at what happens when the two actually meet. The change of democracy that's going on in nearly all countries around the world, and the change of media that we see. The paper I'm writing about it, I try to show that also the media that we have right now, that the change of the media reflects in a way the change of democracy. So I keep them apart here more for analytical reasons than for empirical reasons. One can describe very well how the sort of rise of social media reflects the growing importance of people having a voice, wanting to comment on what the parliament does. But here at the moment, let's just imagine the two sort of meet. What do we see then? Mediated democracy in times of digitalization. Perhaps the most obvious changes we see is the change of the public sphere. We see what my fellow colleagues call pluralized publics. Some people who are very clear about how they judge this, they also talk about fragmented publics, meaning we don't have common reference points anymore. But sort of to describe this in terms of how Benedict Anderson would describe it, we see these imagined communities falling apart anymore. Even though we still have a sense of belonging, the media are not the actors or the forces anymore who mediate that kind of sense of belonging. Instead, a lot of things are happening at the same time. There is, on the one hand, the perhaps most important development, namely what Manuel Castells, the Spanish sociologist, called mass self-communication. The fact that mass media do not dominate the public sphere anymore and are having this powerful role of gatekeepers. We have very, very different sources of information now that all populate the public sphere. And that means that we all can talk and do this to various degrees. This is accompanied by blurring boundaries on the one hand between the private sphere and the public sphere, but also, and that matters more in this context, between producers and consumers of information. In fact, the whole notion of audience is changing. From the times of the mass media, we are used to think of the audience as passive recipients of news produced by a small elite of journalists. Now the audience has a much more active role. Not only does it circulate information, it also helps ranking, sorting, and connecting sources of information. Just by using our phones, walking around with them, we help algorithms to weigh information, to personalize our information streams, and also to sort out the relevance of what actually matters to us. So the audience is not passive anymore. Just as a side effect of communicating and walking around with phones, we really contribute to the order of information streams all the time, without knowing what we are doing, because this is of course a very intransparent, opaque process. But the audience, that's the main thing, is not passive anymore. It plays an active role, and some people even say we are co-producers of the public sphere today, and some people in a neo-Marxist tradition would say this is unpaid labor. exploited by companies such as Facebook, Google, etc. They exploit us in a process that one can compare to early accumulation of capital, just as in the 19th century. So some people describe it in those terms. But the fact is, we are not passive anymore. We are not consumers anymore. And then, of course, we see a strong personalization of information flows organized by social networks, meaning that we do not all see the same thing anymore. I often think when I'm traveling and I see other people looking at their phone that I have no clue what they're looking at. They have no clue what I'm seeing, and that is so radically different from my childhood when we all watched the same news channel in the evening. It's really radically different. And my feeling is that we haven't really thought through yet what the consequences of this change is. We don't even have a vocabulary yet to describe this massive change of what connects and integrates societies. The mechanisms, the dynamics are completely changing. And perhaps it will take another 10, 20 years to describe this. So we have pluralized publics that are characterized by a sort of decline in common reference points. Instead, we have lots of issue-centric networks. Issue-centric networks that are often not sort of evolving within national boundaries anymore, but are transnational. And that is sort of not only bad, it can also be quite liberating to meet people in other countries who are working on the same things or are interested in the same things. So issue-oriented or theme-oriented networks are playing a growing role in the way our publics are structured today. And we cannot know, as I just said, what other people are looking at and what they are actually interested in. And that also means we have no clue of what we don't know. We never had that. It was a big criticism of the gatekeeping role of mass media before their decline, so we should not romanticize the past. It was not everything good during the mass media period. We also did not know at that time, but today we could, of course, know more about what we don't know, but we have no means to achieve that yet. Then we see also, and you are quite aware of that, quite fundamental change in how political election campaigns are actually carried out. I use here an example that was discussed a lot in Europe, and that was the Brexit campaign in the UK. It was the campaigners used a lot of what we call dark ads. These are advertisements that are designed specifically for groups, but are never seen in the public. What this means is that when advertisement is targeted at specific groups, that it's very difficult to criticize it. If you don't know that someone claims that the European Commission will rule out cattle so that the British cannot prepare their beloved afternoon tea anymore, then you cannot criticize this. And that, I think, shows a real damage of the public sphere. The public sphere, the way Habermas in his deliberative model of democracy describes it, is the main force for creating reasonable political decisions. The controversy in public is the source of reason increasing political classes. With the public sphere, we can control them and we can make suggestions of what the parliament should do and should not do. But if campaigning and political information moves into the dark, into WhatsApp groups, then we lack that possibility for public controversies. So I think that is really a concerning issue. Now I come to another area that I find personally very interesting, and that concerns the change of political parties. The literature describes this under the header of parties as movements. We have seen in Europe, but also in the US, a decline in the willingness to vote, but also a steep decline in party membership. Particularly, the young generation doesn't want to commit itself anymore to a sort of long-term loyal support for political parties. They rather do strategic voting, as I described it earlier, for example, by punishing a government or sort of weighing in for a certain party for this specific elections on very specific grounds, meaning they do something pro-copyright or against copyright, and that's why I vote for the Pirate Party this time, something like that. So parties cannot rely on their supporters any longer, and that's why they need to change tactics. And what they do is, for example, by making the boundaries between parties and non-party supporters more fluent. They will, for example, ask supporters to participate in the election of party leadership, or they will ask people to contribute to the development of a new election platform, a sort of party program. So on the one hand, they try to attract short-term engagement of supporters, and on the other hand, what we see is a new type of parties emerging that we did not know of until 10 years ago. And these are parties who might not even have a membership. An example is the party of the right-wing politician Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, who's the only member of his party, and otherwise he only has what he calls followers, a concept that he probably adopted from social media. Followers might be helpful for an election, but of course followers have much less rights as members of a party, right? Their only role is in supporting a specific candidate, but not in deciding on a party program, for example. But what we also see here with all these examples, I could have listed more, say Podemos in Spain is also such a case, is that these parties very much gather around one charismatic male figure. It's a bit like going back to the 19th century, when parties also very much depended on one person that seemed to represent a specific mood or a specific type of protest. And that we see here in many parties, trying to reduce more and more the political agenda and more evolving a persona, a political persona that tries to capture the mood of the people at a specific time. We don't know how long this will evolve and whether it's successful in the long run, but it is a clear trend that we see across the political spectrum. What I find also quite significant is that these new parties try to situate themselves between old cleavages between right-wing and left-wing parties. They pretend to have often no political agenda, but a reform agenda. Enough with A, B, C, D, E, be it corruption in this country, or a lack of innovativeness in other countries. It can be anything. Enough with is becoming a political agenda sufficient to attract lots of people in one election. And that is kind of strange, and I think a bit worrying, that such a thin political agenda is enough to attract enormous amount of voters. And I personally fear that if they cannot deliver on this enough and something else, and let's try a little revolution here, when they cannot deliver on that, what it means in the long term for the willingness of people to vote and to support political parties. So what we see at the same time, next to the changing formation of political parties, is what we call networks and swarms. Particularly the young generation seeks for new organizational forms of political engagement. And that has to do with something being observed also in many countries, that young people want not any longer to adopt a collective identity of political parties and sort of identify with political parties, but express themselves on a more individual level. They want to be individuals as political human beings and support a specific cause and not a party agenda that comprehends many different issues. The examples I here mention are ones from the last years. Right now, what plays a bigger role in Europe is Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion. Both focuses on climate change. The young generation says it's our future, and you politicians only take care of interests of the past. And we want you to become active right now for our future. And a typical characteristic of that kind of engagement is the lack of a center, the lack of formal hierarchies and organizational structures, and the expectation that the political engagement will change something tomorrow. They want to see immediate effects. They do not want to join an organization, wait 10 years until they've climbed the ladder of importance in that organization. They want to skip school on a Friday, go demonstrate on that day, and hopefully something happens the next month. What we see of that kind of organizations is that they're very unstable. They might last half a year, and they are not good at dealing with a decline in participation and support. Often they completely implode and disappear from the surface. They're also not good at scaling. When more and more people join, they really lack the resources to organize people and to sort of form effective campaigns. Part of their identity or their signature even seems to be non-effective, to just sort of issue protest and sort of run very emotional campaigns. So we describe that kind of political action in the literature as connective action in fluid networks. And lots of Twitter campaigns like Me Too, for example, illustrate what is meant by that. Each person that contributes to such a campaign can express the own political message in individual terms. Memes are changed, memes are not only forwarded. Each individual can be creative and express themselves. And the issues people deal with, at least in Europe and the US, are often very much post-material in the sense of that it's often less about jobs, income, etc. It's more about issues of self-realization, of having access to education and things like that. So this is what we see in terms of democratic change, what I meant earlier when I said it's not described by the Constitution, how we should actually practice democracy and the kind of institutions that support this. It sort of evolves beyond that institutions. And I come to the conclusion. The big question, of course, is what do we make of this? I sort of try to describe it in neutral terms, not sort of condemning it, but also not romanticizing what is happening here, but just saying we see significant transformation. And the important point for me is that the social media is not the driver of this. I would rather describe social media as the medium that offers the resources to try out new ways for democratic engagement. And of course, using social media will change the people using it. They will never go back to where they came from. It has a long-term effect of how people understand their own political engagement and also how they perceive the world. It's not that there is no change, but social media as such would not have the agency to actually shape this development. It more comes out of interaction between social media and democratic change. It is worrying in many respects because politics has become less predictable. It's also for members of the parliament never really clear how the response to their action will be. They often feel, because of this phenomenon of the monitory democracy, a bit chased around. A sort of recent example is what happened in Austria last week. Not by a coincidence, 10 days before the European elections, a video suddenly destroys within 2 days a coalition government in Austria. So the vice chancellor had to step down and the government fell apart. So this is these dynamics are sort of the opposite of what we expect from a democratic democracy. And I don't think we will be able to resolve that in the near future. But some things I think should be done, and that is regulation in areas of where political campaigning really becomes manipulative and the problem. For example, dark ads, I think we simply should rule out and ask political campaigners to make clear who they are, where they get their funding from, and who they target. That should be, I think, in the public, in the open. But we would be naive to assume that these small steps of changing campaigning rules will be able to actually impact long-term changes of democracy. I think what we will see here in the long run is institutional reform to sort of reflect the changes of representative democracy that have been underway for a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hofmann. It was a pleasure to hear you. Everyone was fully concentrated, and I think we will have we have enough time for discussion, and I think we will have a very good discussion as well. Thank you again. And the floor is actually yours from the audience. And as usual, you can ask question in English or in Portuguese, no problems at all. Vocês podem fazer pergunta em inglês, em português, e eu vou falar aquilo que eu falo sempre, não importa se as 5 pessoas na frente de vocês falaram em inglês, vocês podem falar em português, não precisa ter vergonha. Vamos lá, é só levantar a mão e acho que tem que falar no microfone, né? I think we have to, we have a microphone because we are...
Alô?
Thank you very much. Congratulations, Professor Jeanette, for a fascinating explanation. I have 2 questions. My first question refers to the apparent paradox triggered by social media. The first paradox is the increase in the possibility to participate in a more robust public sphere. And the second paradox is the manipulation of the public sphere through some forms where individuals can conceal themselves in the anonymity. And the anonymity seems to me one of the most present the risks of democracy. And in our political history, since the 18th century, we have noticed that the visibility of the public sphere has marked the evolution of public sphere. And how do you see this paradox, and how do you see the possibility of anonymity to exercise great influence in political decisions?
Shall I answer now? Thank you for this interesting question. Perhaps I give a more general answer. In order to describe the many phenomena we see emerging in the context of social media, we have coined new terms such as social bots, but also famously fake news. And that term fake news seems to suggest that we are dealing here with a really new phenomena. But I think we are not. Fake news, if you want, have a very long tradition. And in nearly all countries with a public, with a free press, we see journals specialized on fake news, whether they invent new pregnancies of queens, or divorces of famous artists or musicians. That kind of fake news we've had for a very long time, and we all tolerate it because we just assumed that citizens are able to decide for themselves what they believe and what they don't believe. And now suddenly we see a sea change, and fake news are regarded as a threat to democracy. And when we look at the narratives around the election of Trump, the election of Bolsonaro, but also other elections, we are willing to ascribe these unlikely outcomes of elections to fake news. But we have actually no empirical evidence for that. In fact, the evidence is very ambivalent. Of course, it can be that a lot of people believe that the EU will outlaw tea kettles, but is this really likely? I would say there can also be different interpretations of fake news, such as those about the tea kettle. It can be seen as a way of a language that has more of a tribal character. People who situate themselves in the political spectrum in a certain area exchange news that sort of is a play nearly with recognizing each other and using social media to sort of talk to others. The perhaps most important example for that kind of explanation was the attack in Christchurch. The statement of 75 pages, I believe, was full of memes that reflected and took up right-wing networked communication that sort of runs around the globe, where people tell each other stories full of lies, but it means I'm part of this group, and I know you are also part of this group, and now I'm doing something, and at the same time communicating with you in a secret language that all you who sympathize with that kind of political attitude, goals, etc., we talk like that among ourselves. That is one thing, that the interpretation of what is going on around fake news is still open. There are very different explanations of what is going on here. But what I find really dangerous is that the diagnosis of fake news, which assumes this is a new phenomena, seems to cry for a restriction of freedom of speech. Let's create new laws, let's create authorities who decide on our behalf of what is right and what is wrong, and outlaw everything that's wrong, particularly around elections. Do we really want to create such powers? Do we really want our rights, our freedom of opinion to be restricted in the name of a dubious phenomenon such as fake news that is neither legally nor politically well defined? It is just something that is very much pushed by the press, and the press, I'm afraid, often has an agenda here. What they see is that social networks have become a competition in many ways. A competition in terms of agenda setting, a competition for advertising resources, and of course also of power, of defining what is relevant. The press also defends journalistic standards, not for bad reasons. I support very much a professional journalism, but the way the press reports about fake news sort of is also a bit self-serving. And that's why I'm very careful, specifically with this issue, how to interpret this. And I would sort of recommend not to be too fast with asking for regulation. That was a long answer, but it really matters to me. Dear to my heart, this topic.
Professor, thank you for your presentation. I'm from the political science, so I think I'm going to ask a question that goes a little bit beyond what you present. What do you see as perspectives for the adoption of the state from this new social environment that this new communication brought us? So, and especially about new types of participatory institutions, combining inputs from through the internet and the lawmaking, for example. We have some examples here in Brazil, and also, I guess it's all. Thank you.
Okay.
Eu vou fazer em português, porque não ficou muito à vontade para fazer em inglês. Eu li um livro recentemente sobre pós-verdade e fake news de um jornalista britânico, e ele comentava como nessa era da pós-verdade não existe mais uma preocupação em relação à verdade, né, como isso deixou de ser um critério. Isso tem a ver também com um descrédito do pensamento científico e um aumento do pensamento mágico na perspectiva dele. E ele fala como as fake news influenciaram exatamente na eleição do Trump, o Brexit, e como as empresas elas não estão assumindo a sua responsabilidade como guardadoras de dados pessoais, né? Então, empresas como o Google, o Facebook. Mas, enfim, nós temos também uma jornalista, que é a Eliane Brum, que ela já fala de outro conceito, que é a autoverdade, né? Então, como as pessoas elas tendem a querer acreditar naquilo que já se amolda às suas próprias crenças. Daí, assim, eu entendo, né, as ponderações em relação à rapidez em trazer restrições à liberdade de expressão, mas será que com esse momento de forte anti-intelectualismo, será que países em desenvolvimento como o nosso não têm, de fato, talvez uma probabilidade maior de serem mais permeáveis a essas chamadas fake news e isso prejudique mais a nossa democracia, né? Porque os fatos que eles descrevem que as pessoas acreditavam do Trump, da Hillary Clinton, que a família dela era de vampiros e comia criancinhas, eram coisas absurdas, né? E o Bolsonaro também falou coisas absurdas para conseguir se eleger. E por que milhares de pessoas acreditaram nisso, né? Então, enfim, é mais ou menos isso.
Thank you for the presentation. I would like to ask about the EU elections. Today is the first day of the election, and I would like to listen to your opinion about the huge campaign that the EU institutions made about making people conscious how important it is to take part of this election. 5 years ago, I remember nobody talked about this election, and now everybody's talking. They created the hashtag this time I'm voting and so on. Yeah. But I ask myself if we are not talking with a bubble. Because, of course, if I look at my European friends, everybody made Erasmus and speak many languages. Some are a child of binational parents. So what about people that live in the countryside and have no idea what EU does for them? So I would like to ask about, and also I saw in a statistic that young people normally don't go vote for EU elections. And it's very interesting that you talk about, for example, the movement Fridays for the Future, and they don't believe that MIPs can make something for them, because most of the MIPs, they are not young. They are normally the parties, they send people to Brussels that are already in the end of their careers. We all know this. But for example, on the other hand, when you talk about the regulation of internet, the GDPR, one of the MLPs that were most engaged was the Jan-Philipp Albrecht, and he is very young. So I would like to listen about this scenario.
First to the question of other forms of participation. What we see, one of the examples beyond movements, swarms, and these kind of things are multi-stakeholder arrangements, sort of attempts to formalize the participation of non-governmental experts, but also civil society groups. And the result with that, I would say, is pretty mixed. I've done research on this and also have participated in several multi-stakeholder efforts. And there are several problems with that. First of all, there's always an asymmetry in terms of resources. The private sector is always well-equipped, civil society not. So it's very difficult to actually create arrangements where civil society has an equal say, because the equal say, like democracy as such, is so dependent on resources. When people are not well educated, they cannot express their rights and make use of their rights of political self-determination. So, and that affects also all sorts of new arrangements. But I can see that as a model it spreads, that more and more governments are willing, also for reasons of legitimacy, to include civil society groups in complicated, complex processes of decision making. So that's one thing. Then the question about fake news. Is it not a bigger problem than I describe it? Of course, we do see lots of organized campaigns that work with this method, and I'm still inclined to think that there might be short-term effect, but long-term effect will go down, because people just notice. If they believe this about tea kettles once, they won't believe it a second time when it's about another issues. But it's not true that there is no regulation. We see, for example, that the big social networks train their algorithms to detect these kind of campaigns. And that also shows the ambivalence of any kind of regulation in this area. Of course, what they learn is these algorithms is they see organized campaigns when it comes at the same time from various sites. They discover fake newspapers. These kind of things they are able to detect easily. But on the other hand, they always sort of take down too much. They will not be able ever to identify satire, for example. same thing with copyright regulation. Algorithms will discover something, but they're unable to discover a quote and leave that online. So the problem is that these algorithms will always be very powerful and take down more, and thereby also restrict our right to communication. And I think that is probably true for all types of regulation, no matter whether it concerns a machine or a court that will take down. It is a danger that it restricts the public sphere, and in my mind that then would constitute a real paradox, that the social media on the one hand provide us with the means to communicate more than we ever could before, but at the same time we do this at the cost of freedom of speech. That would be a real paradox, and that's why I'm always cautious. I do think it's okay to create laws that will more effective to sort of implement laws, as we got with this German law that forces social networks to respond within a certain time to takedown requests. I don't like the way the law is sort of done in detail, but the idea as such I think is good. Laws that we have should also be enforced, and social networks have to play a role here. But I find it a problem if we delegate that kind of job to the private sector only, and if we don't at the same time create the means for citizens to object to takedowns when they think they're unfair or not, or done for the wrong reasons. So my feeling is that freedom of speech is in danger at the moment, and we should be careful. And then about how important it is to participate in elections, I've noticed that too. A lot of campaigns also from NGOs and social groups. One of the motives behind this is, of course, is to make right-wing parties not strong, to sort of have lots of, because people are afraid that with the European elections, right-wing voters might be more motivated to go to the ballot than centrist and left-wing voters, and that is indeed a problem, because so many voters today are really frustrated for the reasons that I mentioned, that we live in a period when representative democracy doesn't deliver anymore to the extent it was once promised to us. So it's true that particularly among young people, the inclination to vote is very low. That was also a problem in Brexit. People only noticed afterwards how much they damaged themselves, their own interests, by not voting in the referendum. But at the same time, one should not forget this, we do see at the moment a surprising rise of green parties. In Germany, they're around 20%. It's not quite clear whether that is a long-term development, but you see here that young people are willing, who are sort of sensitive to climate and environmental issues, to go for a party that promises to do more about these issues than other parties. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just because I cut the line, because my question has to do with your last words. Actually, you kind of sort of partially answered to my question. Is you describe some movements, the young people, they're concerned with the environment, they don't like hierarchical structures and so on. So why, and then we're talking about the crisis of political parties. Actually, we're talking about the crisis of political parties. I think since ever, and why not the green parties? So they are young. They have a platform that it's concerning with the environment and lack of hierarchy, gender equally in gender and issues. So. Is the future the green parties, or we really are experiencing a crisis, a real crisis this time? So I have actually other questions, but since you already talk about the green parties.
Thank you, Professor Hofmann, for your lecture. Hi, over here.
Thank you.
So could I please ask you to comment on what your opinion is on the possible links between encryption and political participation or digital political participation? And I have recently read a paper on the crypto movement around the 2017 Catalan referendum, where the central Spanish government directed the police to cut internet access in the polling places, so as to cripple the referendum, the clandestine referendum that was taking place over there. And I was wondering if encryption is usually seen only from the criminal law perspective, but there's an important aspect here of political participation and popular mobilization using encryption, and on the other side, government or central traditional structures moving to exert even more control than was traditionally possible before the internet. Thank you.
Once again, thank you for the lecture. I'd like to ask a question that maybe takes a more economic perspective, because as these companies such as Facebook, Google, and Twitter become increasingly important in the political scenario, it makes me wonder how that monopoly that they hold, which is strongly based on their algorithms, on the data that they have collected, and all of that is protected by copyright law and private property and contractual law in general. How can we hold them accountable from a democratic perspective when all of these tools, and not only the practice on the social networks, but the very technology and the very tools that they're using are not open to the public? So we can question, well, how are these ads being targeted? How is my data being used to target political advertisements to me, or to show certain groups that I could be interested in participating? And the economic part comes in. They are private companies, right? So not only we can see them from this political perspective, but also from the business model that they use, which not only motivates them, but also constrains them, because they have to make money somehow. So what tools can we have from a market perspective to offer alternatives? Should we use regulation to say, no, you actually have to open your algorithms that can be your private property? Or should we allow it, but instead strengthen other alternatives, such as open source alternatives? Thank you.
I start with the last question because that's also really a pet topic of mine. I love that kind of question. What should we do about the big IT industry? First of all, we see some change here. Over the last years, these social networks get really criticized a lot, and they fear reputation damage. One can see that. So they become a bit more open-minded talking to the regulator. Mark Zuckerberg just 10 days ago did a tour through Europe again, praising the data protection regulation, and that he's now willing to apply it worldwide, and so do the other countries, the other companies. And could we please also come up with rules for content regulation, because they now see they are not the ones to decide what should be online, what should be taken down. And in the US, due to their freedom of speech tradition, they have a little problem here. They're sort of paralyzed. So please, EU, could you handle this problem and do it in a way that we know what to do in the future? So even if we think this is just propaganda, he wouldn't have said such a thing 5 years ago. So they are moving closer together. And there is a window opening for setting up rules that might satisfy both sides, creating a stable market, and the other hand, increasing accountability of these companies. But personally, I think the whole business model is wrong, and I'm not a fan of the data protection regulation because it seems to stabilize that that business model by saying, throwing the ball back to the individuals and saying it's for you to decide whether you want to give away your data or not. We know it's not for us to decide. The deal is really a bad one. So I think we need to reform data protection regulation to get a grip on that and ask them to develop a plan B, to come up with a business model that is not based on commercializing or commodifying our personal data. Personally, I would not want a new generation growing up that never knew even the concept of privacy. That is such a disempowerment of people. I found that really uncivilized. So for me, something serious change is necessary, and that goes beyond the regular tools that we have right now. I see the time has not come yet, but I hope that at some point we think about alternatives. Another issue that I find quite interesting is that because they are monopolies and they sort of provide in basic ways the public sphere today, should we not treat them as public utilities, as public infrastructures that therefore needs to sort of accept closer scrutiny than any private entity? So the way we treat infrastructures for electricity, water, etc., are there not equivalents? So it's up for you lawyers to think about principles of equality between this kind of infrastructure and other infrastructures. Are there not critical infrastructures that we really depend on? And a final aspect I want to mention, I've been part of a campaign that thought about a European digital charter. What kind of human rights do we need to protect our human rights in the digital age? And one of the ideas that we brought forward and got massively criticized by the lawyers is the suggestion that human rights should not only define the relationship between individuals against the state, but also our rights towards private companies. Why do we need to make laws to implement our rights vis-à-vis companies? Why can't they be held accountable? Why can't we ask them to protect our human rights? So that is another. So lots of aspects come together here, but I really love that question. The crisis of political parties. It's true, we see, that's why I said it's a long-term decline of political parties. They sort of get hollowed out. And do we see now the crisis of the crisis? I can't say that, but I'm definitely a friend of saying this is a long-term development and not something that just came around the corner a few years ago. And are the Green parties here an exception? I would say they benefit from what I call post-material values and norms. They seem to represent a different orientation of young people, but they do this typically in wealthy economies. I'm not sure about countries where the social inequality is even bigger than in Western countries. Will they ever convince people that they should do farming in a different way and should care about pollution? I'm not sure. That's actually for you to respond. But they do, I think, represent different values. And then there was another, encryption and political participation. Also a nice topic because it is so full of goal conflicts. On the one hand, one can say encryption is really good, and I believe in the right to anonymity because we want to avoid chilling effects. I should be able to express my political opinions even if they are not popular, and I can do this in a better way when I have a right to anonymity. And on the other hand, we see that encryption tools massively abused, both in terms of cybercrime, but of course also by secret services, right? So it's a contested issue where lots of people make use for it for different purposes. And that's why I think one should look at it as a contested field. There is no single answer to how we should actually assess it. It's a contested issue.
I'll cut the line again. You were answering to my question before I asked them, and it's about the maybe the difference between welfare states, society in a welfare state, and society in countries they are still in development. Yeah, and yeah, that's it. And I think in end of your lecture you mentioned that many of them people are protesting that they're not interested in jobs and so on. There's a self-presentation issue and so on. But I think in a country like Brazil, they are really concerned with their jobs. I need money, I need job, I need some kind of stability, and the state doesn't provide for me. So maybe both the political party crisis and the influence of mass of social media and so on should be interpreted differently in welfare states and other countries, because okay, all right, that's it. Oh.
I'm fully aware that what I present is a European picture of things that doesn't necessarily apply. Some things do. I think the party crisis and sort of this hollowing out of our traditional understanding of representative democracy, I think that you see here too. Even if you are a rather young democracy, you sort of skipped many decades and got very fast where other European countries are right now. But the full picture differs from country to country and continent to continent.
Maybe that's why green parties are not successful at all in Brazil. Or are not concerned with the environment.
But you should. You still should.
Of course. Yeah. And people in the green parties in Brazil, they're not young. They're
Yeah.
old, and they're well. This sorry, Daniel. Sorry.
So thanks, Professor Hofmann, again for this very insightful discussion. I'd like to hear more from you about the European perspective in this agenda. I think that we've been seeing lots of different initiatives and pushes from European countries. Last year, the IGF, President Macron gave a very impactful speech, kind of urging countries, and especially Europe, to regulate more the internet. And then I think there's this urge kind of comes from this need to blame someone from what's happening, and usually social media is the easiest to blame. And in Germany, we also have laws like the NetzDG. So there's like this whole agenda, and I also agree very much with you about the GDPR that is now being exported to a whole bunch of countries, and Brazil is included. We just passed data protection law that is very much in line with the GDPR, which is based on the consent idea, which is very questionable. So I'd like to hear from you about this European perspective of regulating, and on the flip side of that, what do you also think of companies taking the initiative to regulate themselves? And then Facebook now is talking about creating an oversight board, and which is going to act like a Supreme Court of Facebook, and all this new initiatives taken by companies that are really being based on their own values, and then they're going to be imposed in the whole world. So, thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Professor Hofmann. Very good lecture. And I'll come back with what we call the algorithm transparency that we mentioned before. And sorry, I think I'm gonna kind of disagree a little bit with what you mentioned about DPR and also Dennis, because I guess if we go into the various data protection generations of data protection laws, maybe in the fourth, the sixth generations, and I guess the first ones that were really much based on consent, and the new ones as GDPR and the Brazilian, they even take into account that people cannot consent to everything. They are not aware of what is how their data use is processed, and they go even further. They put obligations, they put limitations, and what companies and even the public sphere, the government can do with the data. And I guess when it comes to the algorithm transparency, I guess it goes in that fashion in a way. I guess there are three different problems, and it's even my PhD research is on that, is very much in that topic. I guess there is one problem that is limitation that is imposed by the regulation. One is the one that it comes to the intellectual property limitation that you put it there on secrecy of the algorithm. The second problem is the technical one that you're gonna have, even though if you could have access to the source code and everything, sometimes even the with artificial intelligence and machine learning, even the companies, they cannot say what the algorithm is doing. Yeah. So that's a technical problem. There's a third problem when it comes to cognition. Even if you could have access to the data, to the source code, if you could limit that, would people understand what is done with their data to consent authorizing? And that comes to the limitation when you have data protection law. Even if people do not understand what is done with that data, we're going to impose some limitations. And my question goes to that. On technical perspective, there are some initiatives that say, okay, you can only design systems that are able to be explainable. So you can provide explainability to the public sphere. The regulations put that saying that you need to allow for explainability, so the right to explanation that you maybe or maybe not have on GDPR in the Brazilian law. And the explanation, should be in a way that people could even understand that. So my question goes, from a regulatory perspective, taking into account what the GDPR has done and the Brazilian law has done, what might be a better solution in order to take into account how the society would understand what is really done with that with their data? There are some new theories like counterfactual explanations by Professor Sina Wagner from Oxford University. Some other was some explainability by design and so on. Would like to hear your perspective on that. Thank you.
I was just wondering about one of the last lines of your lecture when you said, well, you proposed a very cautious approach to regulation, and your fear is on freedom of expression. But one thing that you suggested, well, perhaps regulations like in areas like political campaigning, which can become very manipulative, can be proposed. And I was. The phenomenon of manipulation has many layers and many potentials in the internet, and one way to see that is that actually manipulation is everywhere. The potential of manipulation is everywhere, collecting your data, profiling you, etc. So I was wondering, how is it able to operationalize that kind of regulation? Where do you draw the line in terms of it might seem naive to think that there is something distinguishable called political campaigning that starts at a particular date, and from that particular date there is regulation. But see, and you also said with this conclusion that, well, perhaps that we shouldn't be that much. I'm not sure I understood that correctly, but perhaps we shouldn't be that much concerned with the long-term effects, but actually with the short-term effect, and I'm not sure I understand that as an optimistic or pessimistic or pragmatic, because in a way, in the long term, perhaps all that we had in terms of democratic institutions did already erode. I'm not sure that is a fatalistic way to put the problem.
Bom, bom dia. Eu vou falar em português, peço desculpas por isso. Na verdade, a minha dúvida tem bastante a ver com... Acho que sai um pouco das questões tratadas até o momento, mas acredito que tenha uma certa integração também com o tema, mas voltado para o desenvolvimento de uma agenda de crowd law. Então, em que sentido a professora entenderia que existiria alguma certa possibilidade de atuação política por meio de ferramentas tecnológicas desenvolvidas para participação no desenvolvimento e avaliação de todo o ciclo de políticas públicas, e que tipo de interferência essa forma de fragmentação política que tem sido observada e principalmente que foi relatada durante a palestra poderia acarretar numa certa forma de necessidade de se repensar o que é representatividade e qual é a legitimidade da participação por meio de ferramentas tecnológicas na democracia.
It's not easy to. That's why translator have to every 30 minutes to 15 minutes pause. Okay.
Mhm. Ja, ist guter Punkt. Aha. Shall I now reply?
Yeah.
Okay, now I need to find the first one. Yeah, European perspective on regulation. First of all, of course, from Brazil you think we are a unity, but from a European perspective we are very heterogeneous. So France has a completely different understanding of regulation than the UK, for example. UK traditionally being super liberal about markets, and France trying to demonstrate the strong state. So it's very difficult for the EU to agree on anything. Actually, since the extension of the EU, it has become nearly impossible. It's very, very difficult and takes a long time to develop a common understanding of things. With GDPR, the data protection regulation, it worked out after a while, but even that was watered down and it took a long time, was super controversial, so really not easy. And I would say generally for the EU one can see that over the last 20, 30 years the power, the authoritative regulatory power of the states has gone down, and the self-regulatory skills of the companies, but also their muscle, sort of the insisting on doing their own rules, has massively expanded. To the extent that even existing laws are sometimes not fully implemented or enforced because the private sector is so strong, and because governments always think, ooh, global competition. If we sort of put fines on our automotive industry, it's now a German example, when we put too much fines on them, they might not be able to compete anymore. And do we not damage ourselves more by enforcing our law than by letting them just slip through the net? So there are lots of goal conflicts, if you want, and that makes it hard. But having said that, I would assume that if problems seem to increase more and more, and the governments being less and less able to actually effective act on them, we might see a sea change again, that what I would call as a political scientist as collective agency and collective understanding of democracy might rise again at the expense of our very much individualized understanding of democracy. I wouldn't be surprised about that, but it will probably take some time. And the problems, of course, don't go away. So it's a bit difficult for the EU to agree, and generally we are more relying on the market as an agent of solving issues than on governments in many respects. Then the question of algorithmic transparency, very good issue. First I would like to make a point again about informed consent. I had, he was mentioned, Philipp Albrecht, I had real arguments him about the question whether data protection should also in future rest on the notion of human dignity. He, as a lawyer, very much normatively committed to that principle. Personally, I think it's the wrong approach to data protection. Of course, individual freedom is a great value, but it doesn't help us much when we are dealing with big companies that sort of dominate markets to such a degree. So I would wish for more collective agency in the sense of, say, strong consumer agencies, for example, who take care of consumer or individual interests on our behalf, so that they can say that they use the legal tools they have to say, this is an unfair deal, please correct that. Don't ask for all the personal data as a currency, because it's not what people really want, and there must be other ways for you to make money. The algorithmic transparency I find very interesting, because lots of people ask for that. And when you look at the literature, it tells you how very difficult it is. There are, you might know about this literature, there are a few articles that actually criticize this notion. There is one by a computer scientist and anthropologist. His name is Paul Dorisch. Do you know that paper? Okay, so no news here. I like it very much because he describes in detail what the strange beast algorithms actually are. They are sort of distributed in terms of machine learning. They change all the time. And what is perhaps more important, what they actually do doesn't depend so much on the algorithm as such, but on the data they operate. So it's very much the context that determines what an algorithm does. But if the data set is changing all the time, or differs between what one company does here and the same company does somewhere else, so what is actually the object of regulation? And that sort of will become a bigger issue in digital regulation generally, that the objects of regulation are so ephemeral, I think is the word. They are very intangible and hard to grasp. And that, I think, will create a headache for regulation in general. And what I criticize about that paper by Paul Dorisch is that he doesn't offer a solution. He just describes why lawyers and computer scientists talk past each other, but sort of don't understand each other. It's good to understand better why it doesn't work, but he doesn't offer any solution either. So I don't have one either, but I like with my sort of background in sociology of technology, I very much like the idea that the regulatory discourse creates objects that are sort of fictitious, that don't exist. They're fictional in the sense of that we ascribe properties to algorithms that don't match the reality of those who develop them. That I like as an idea, but that's no answer. I know that literature too, sort of they should be self-explanatory, and I think in specific contexts, say you go to a bank and ask for a mortgage, and it's denied, that you can ask for explanations that have to do something with you as a person. Data protection regulation offers this, and I think that's a step in the right direction. And whether we can make that a more general principle for powerful algorithms that regulate our everyday life more and more, I don't know, because I don't know enough about algorithms, but I like the idea. As a principle, it sounds very elegant. Okay, so the cautious approach to regulation. That is another reason why we should be cautious, because we often don't understand thoroughly to regulate. But also, and that is that precautionary principle, among other things, says, what if we create rules that stick around for a long time, but the stuff that they are supposed to regulate change all the time? And that is a bit of an issue here, I think. Rules that we once established are very difficult to get rid of anymore. That's why we have these sunset clauses now in some innovative environments, but often they just stay, right? And that, I think, we need to take into account. But there's another issue I haven't mentioned yet, and that has to do with the fact that regulation in the IT world has very different effects on big and small companies. Facebook, for example, has this huge law department, and they just create a new architecture for their contractual things, and then they say, data protection regulation, not an issue for us anymore. But for a small company, they struggle, I mean, to a degree, and that concerns particularly the new copyright regulation in Europe. This Article 13 sort of effectively rules out startups in that area, because they will never have the resources to actually develop that filter specific for products they might want to bring to the market. If you need so much capital to implement a ruling, then a really privileged big established companies with a lot of resources. And that is probably true for other areas too. The EU is great talking with big companies about how can we regulate you, but they do not take enough into account what it means for small and medium-sized companies, in particular startups in that area. Yeah. So new ways of e-democracy and consequences for representation. Something I didn't mention in my presentation is that we see sort of experiments with direct democracy. Lots of these new initiatives who would not want to become members of a party try to sort of establish new ways of having their voice being heard. Liquid democracy, the idea that the Pirate Party came up with, is one of these examples. I'm personally not a big fan, but I find it interesting to watch new, also app-based forms of raising one's voice. So there are attempts to introduce more elements of direct democracy, because all the arguments we had against it and in favor of representative democracy do not fully apply anymore in digitalized environments.
Can I raise a closing question? What's your personal advice on how we should behave? Your personal advice on how we should behave with regards to social media, internet in general, for a layperson like myself, probably not that many in the audience. Yeah, Virgilio has his own answer, but I
would be interested in that. So perhaps the last answer should.
Yeah.
Okay, but I will talk about this too. I happen to be a part of a circle of people who are regularly talking with Facebook, and it's sort of super interesting to hear Facebook talking about their perspective on issues. And in many ways, it reverses what we read, at least in the European press. In the European press, the sort of general sound is always the same. Facebook, Twitter, Google, they're so arrogant, they just don't respond to our requests for takedown, etc. Facebook just last week gave us an example from the Austrian elections where the story was the other way around. The Social Democrats in Austria had set up 2 pages on Facebook. They were clearly manipulative. They tried to sort of damage the reputation of the competitor Sebastian Kurz. So what did Facebook do? They called the public authorities and asked them to send a request for data of the owners of these 2 sites. And what happened? Nobody responded. So there is a lot of sort of miscommunication or non-communication between these companies and public authorities. They work at very different speeds, and lots of our public authorities are not up to their tasks and their responsibilities at the moment. And as a response, we privatize lots of that or automate things. And this is something we will have to deal with, this interface with between the private sector and public authorities, and think about clever solutions, how we can make that more efficient. Ask ourselves, what can we automate? Who controls what's automated, and what kind of mechanisms of appeal need to accompany this? But I do think that because it's such a massive issue, if we all participate in mass communication, we cannot handle this with traditional court orders anymore. that is just a 19th century technology in a sort of modern world.
Like our electoral vote. If they thought that the last election they controlled.
Yeah. But I do see big issues coming, particularly also with regard to the effect that since everything is digitally mediated today, there needs to be a rule for everything that we do. No matter whether we trade digitally, whether we just communicate, algorithms have to decide, will it stay online, will it get a takedown, or some other measures. And that gives companies who run these algorithms an enormous power. And I think we need to deal with that. We need to check that power in one way or another. And will you now also give an answer?
Oh, my answer is very short. Quit it. Or actually, in my case, don't even enter it. So
really? No, you can't.
Yeah,
that's not possible.
Yes, it is. I'm just a crazy guy.
You don't get the toothpaste back into the tube.
Yes, I know. I'm just living in a parallel world, I think. I don't have a Facebook account, a Twitter account, Instagram account. I don't use WhatsApp.
But you miss out.
I know. But I think I miss out a lot of things. But I'm not sure. I think, it's a long thing. Actually, when you talk about the privacy for the future, the current generation, it was... you had to also. It was good to. Or it would be bad for a generation not to know what privacy is all about. Well, when I say that to my students, they think, "Oh, this old man. They want to misses the past." And use encryption and only open source software and computer or smartphone and such a thing. I don't know where I'm going. Well, I would like to thank everyone here, and I would like again to thank the embassy, the German embassy, and the German general consulate in São Paulo. I would like to thank the audience. I would like to remind you that we will have a very busy week next week. I think Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, both with Andrea Posas from the UNAM in Mexico, and with Matthias Kumm from New York University and the Humboldt University in Berlin. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Wednesday and Friday. Yes, Wednesday and Friday. And of course, thank you very much, Professor Hofmann. It was a pleasure to have you here. I hope you enjoy as well. And till the next time. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
können später. Ja? Haben Sie schon per Mail Kontakt gemacht? Ja? Okay.